Hello and welcome to session 2, using formative assessment data to inform CRA. Your presenters today are Jason Betzner, Mackenzie Turbeville, and Cami Williams. Our goal for today is to intentionally use student formative assessment data to improve CRA instruction. Some next steps we'd like you to think about are using at least one formative assessment daily in your classroom, and reflect on how assessment data can inform your instruction. Below, we've listed some outcomes and some people who can support you in reaching your goal. Before moving further, we'd like you to pause the video for a moment and take a look at the Padlet that we provided access to you here. If you go to the link or use the QR code, you'll find a Padlet that'll ask you about some formative assessments that you use in your classroom. So we'd like you to just list some favorite formative assessments that you use before a lesson or after a lesson, and why you like those formative assessments. Let's review the difference between formative and summative assessments. Summative assessment is an assessment that's used at the end of a lesson or the end of a unit to see what students have learned. Usually, these take the form of tests, quizzes, or projects. A formative assessment is something you use to inform your teaching and inform learning. You're using it during the lesson, before the lesson, and after the lesson to constantly check student progress and see if they've understood what you've been trying to teach them. Some examples of formative assessment might be entrance tickets, exit tickets, thumbs up or thumbs down, using whiteboards to have students work out a problem, and others. John Hattie looked at formative assessments and looked at how effective those were on student learning. And he came up with an effect size of 0.48. So if you look at this graph here, anything above a 0.40 is going to have a higher impact on student learning. So if formative assessment is at 0.48, that means that it has quite a high effect on student learning in your classroom. Let's watch a quick video that describes how formative assessment forms instruction in your classroom.
To me, formative assessment describes all those processes by which teachers and learners use information about student achievement to make adjustments to the students' learning that improve their achievement. So it's about using information to adapt your teaching and adapt the work of the students to put the learning back on track, if you like, to make sure that the learning is proceeding in the right direction and to support that learning. So it's what happens when you don't just lecture students and rattle through the material till you get to the end and ask them if they've understood it okay. It's constantly making those adjustments. One of the ways I like to talk about it is just imagine what would happen if a pilot flew like many teachers assess. So I flew back from Seattle a few weeks ago. Just imagine what the pilot would have done. He would have flown east for 9 hours, and then after 9 hours, he says it's time to land. So he'll put the plane down and he'll ask, is this London? And of course, even if it's not London, he says, whatever, he's got to get off because I've got to get onto the next journey. And that's exactly the way that we've assessed in the past. We teach students material, and at the end of that teaching, we find out if they learned it or not. And if they haven't, we say, too bad, because we're on to the next unit. So what formative assessment does is encourages teachers to take constant readings about where students are, just in the same way that a pilot takes constant readings about their position. And if the learning isn't proceeding as you planned, then you make adjustments. That's the essence, to me, of formative assessment. So the reason I think that formative assessment is the right focus is because assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. It's only through assessment of some kind that you know whether what has been taught has been learned. That's why I think this focus on this assessment process, minute by minute and day by day, not at the end of the sequence of learning, minute and day by day, allows teachers to reflect on their practice and make small steps in improving that practice in a more powerful way than anything we've seen before.
That video makes a really great point about how formative assessment is a constant check. We're making constant checks to make adjustments in our teaching and constant checks on student learning to see where they are during instruction. Formative assessment is really a cycle, and it informs our instruction as well as informs the student where they are at. For example, how do you know if students have learned what you've taught them? I can think of a story of a child who taught his dog how to ride a skateboard. And he brings over all his friends and he says, look, I've taught my dog how to ride a skateboard. This is going to be amazing, incredible. And all his friends are really excited, and they're so excited to see this dog ride a skateboard. They've never seen this before. And they stand around and wait and watch, and nothing happens. And at one point, one of the boy's friends said, hey, I thought you said you taught your dog how to ride a skateboard. And the boy says, I taught him. I didn't say he learned it. And that's often what we do in our classrooms, right? We teach students and then we give them a summative assessment. And we've hoped that they've learned what we've taught them. But wouldn't it be great if we knew that they learned what we taught them along the way, right? Wouldn't it be great if that boy who had taught his dog how to skateboard had constantly checked and see, does the dog know how to stand on the skateboard? Does the dog know how to push the skateboard with his feet? Can the dog balance on a skateboard? And then bring his friends over and show him, wow, this dog can really skateboard. And that's what we mean by these constant checks and readjustments. So what are some best practices for formative assessment? Number one, identify the gap in the learning. So what is the gap that students have in what you're trying to teach them? Doing formative assessments can help you with that. If you give a student an exit ticket at the end of the lesson and they don't understand what you've taught them, then you've identified there's some gaps there. How are you going to fill those gaps tomorrow? Provide constructive and timely feedback to the student. That timely feedback is extremely important. How many times have you gotten feedback at the end of the year and said, well, I have this feedback, but there's not really much I can do with it now until next year. It would have been great if I had had that feedback a few months ago. I might have been able to make some adjustments in my teaching, and I would have made those adjustments at that point instead of waiting until the next year. Students are the same way. If you give them timely feedback on their progress while they're learning the material, they're more likely to make those adjustments in a way that's actually going to be beneficial to them. Number three, use learning progressions. That means breaking down the learning goal into smaller sub-goals and work with the student to set those goals. Working with the student to set those goals is powerful because the student has ownership over their own learning. And then student involvement. Students can keep track of their goals and their progress. Maybe provide students with a list of concepts that they're expected to learn by the end of the unit and have the student check off when they feel like they've mastered that content. And you can work with that student to make sure that they're making progress throughout the lesson. Formative assessment along with timely feedback has a really high effect size, 0.70. That means that students are really getting something out of that feedback. It's really helping them to understand where they are and where they need to go. We talked earlier about how formative assessment is a cycle. You're going to find out what students know before you begin teaching. You're going to use formative assessments during your teaching to monitor and adjust. But what happens after that? What are you going to do tomorrow if students didn't understand the lesson today? Hopefully, you're going to reflect and plan on some next steps. It might be the case that every student in your classroom understands what you've taught them and has mastered the material, but most likely that won't be the case. Some students will have mastered it right away. Some students need a little help, and other students may need a lot of help. One way you can help out each group of students is to put them into small groups. You can use the data from your formative assessments to plan out your groups ahead of time and know what kinds of problems those students are going to be working on and who's going to be responsible for helping those students in their small groups. In this video, we're going to listen to some teachers discuss how they make flexible groups using data and formative assessments in their classroom.
I'm trying to make the kids more aware of where they're at. So we talk a lot about that self-advocacy and having them identify if they've mastered a concept or where they need help. So sort of a baseline, can you do the problem? Can you do the mathematics? Can you solve the problem? But then that mastery piece comes in when you can really apply it outside of that one box that you're in. So we work a lot with word problems. We work a lot with applying it to the school or applying it to the community. And that's really conferencing based. So we sit down and we talk with the kids. Here's your entrance ticket. Tell me what you did here and why you think you should be going to seminar. Or tell me why you think you've mastered this concept, and really getting them to understand and explain why they think they're in those certain groupings.
So data definitely is a tool that we use to drive instruction. We take an NWEA test 3 times a year. And so that's one way that we'll group our students. And on a day-to-day level, we use Lexia, ST Math, and NWEA has a program where we can have our students take a skills locator, which will break down individually where they're struggling. And then we'll kind of group our students that way and provide small group instruction. And then the cool thing about that is that site provides mastery checks, so we can see who's gaining the knowledge that they need, and then kind of readjusting our groups that way as well.
In addition to that, we use a lot of formative assessments to also group students based on skill and ability. Just within a particular lesson, a formative assessment will be given.
Like
a
an exit
summative
ticket.
assessment will be given, and then as a team through 4 and 5, we kind of align the students based on the skills that they need, rather than based on grade level.
To help you with your formative assessment journey, we provided a number of formative assessments and their descriptions on the Google site. There's a link to it here where you can go to the Google site later and find them. And we encourage you to find at least one formative assessment from this list and try it out in your classroom this week. You may want to start with something you already feel comfortable with, maybe something you've done before, maybe something that you can do really easily without a whole lot of planning ahead of time. And then we encourage you to expand upon those formative assessments and look for some other formative assessments that maybe you haven't used before and give them a try.